End of the beginning, Chapter 2. Akamu and his two companions gasped as they stepped into the city of New Atero. Though many would be shocked by the sheer size of the village, this was not the reason the group was so surprised. It was all the Matoran and Agori that were there that shocked them. The city was home to mostly Fire Tribe Agori and Ta-Matoran, and the Po-Matoran lived just outside the city inside huts. It was also home to the majority of the secondary elementals. To the left of the group was a huge bustling marketplace. To the right was the residential housing, and if one continued going straight, they would reach a fiery castle where Turaga Vakama and Ranu, the retired Fire Agori leader, stayed. It was just starting to get dark, though one could barely notice the difference, thanks to the pillars of fire that lined the village streets. Akamu stopped a Ta-Matoran who wore an orange Kanohi Akaku and said, "Hey, you there, with the Akaku. Can you tell me where I can find a Toa of Sonics named Krakua?" The Matoran shook his head and pointed towards the fiery castle, and replied, "Go to the Ta-Kini castle and ask Vakama. He'll know." The Ta-Matoran rushed off towards the market, and the three Matoran of Earth headed off towards the castle. When they reached the castle, another Ta-Matoran, who introduced himself as Kapura, brought them to a room where a Turaga who wore a noble Kanoi Huna stood. When he saw the three Anu Matoran, he said, "Ah, Chronicler, it's good to see you. I hope your journey was well. I suppose you are here to read from the Wall of History?" The Po-Matoran just finished piecing it back together here at the castle. He pointed towards a long wall to his left. Akamu shook his head and replied, "No, actually I've come seeking a Toa of Sonics named Krakua." Vakama frowned and said, "Almost all the Toa left on a mission to the Valley of the Maze. Though that name does sound like one of the ones that stayed. Let me check the tablet with the list of those who went." He went over to an intricately crafted stone desk, clearly made by Po-Matoran crafters, that had 6 or 7 tablets laying on it. He grabbed one, scanned it for a moment, and then said, "You're in luck. He is one of the only 2 that stayed behind. He would probably be staying on the edge of town, near the Po-Koro residential homes, though I don't know why. He's a Toa of Sonics and most of them hate noise." Akamu thanked him and headed back outside. Damek stopped him as they were about to go down towards the houses and said, "Do you think we could go over to the marketplace for a little while first? I've got loads of extra widgets, and I've been wanting to buy some things here anyway." Akamu nodded, and the group steered their usul crabs around towards the market. There were many traders and salesmen in the market, mostly Ta-Matoran and Po-Matoran, as well as a few low Matoran, Matoran of magnetism, and even a Phi Matoran who was selling Ninra ghost technology. The group stopped first at a stall owned by a Ta-Matoran selling strange glowing objects he called dark stones. They were like light stones, except they created a dark hue rather than one of light. Damek bought one, and the group headed over to a Po-Matoran selling small detailed statues of the Toa Nuva and Toa Mari. Midak said, "I'd like one of Toa Matoro, please." The salesman, whose name was Ayako, said, "I'm sorry, I just sold my last one. He did save the universe after all. He's quite popular, especially since he returned." At that moment, the conversation was interrupted as a Po-Matoran wearing a cow bumped into Midak, causing him to fall over. The Po-Matoran exclaimed, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here, let me help you up." Midak reached out his hand, and as the other Matoran helped him up, he said, "Kiwi?" The Po-Matoran's jaw dropped, and he said, "Midak?" The two smiled and hugged, and Kiwi said, "It's good to see you again. What brings you here to New Atero?" Midak dusted himself off and replied, "I'm here with the new Chronicler." He pointed towards Akamu, and Kiwi said, "It's an honor." He bowed slightly, and continued, "I was just snagging the last Matoro figure from Ayako here." He held up a figure wearing a Trina, and Midak said, "It's too bad he had to give up his own life to save us." Kiwi's eyes widened. "You haven't heard the good news, then?" Midak gave him a confused look and said, "What news?" Kiwi's face brightened up, and a huge grin formed on his face as he said, "Matoro is alive!" The 3 Anu Matoran's jaws dropped, and Damek said, "He's what?" Kiwi continued, "He appeared 3 days ago, out of nowhere. He saved Turaga and Nua, and sent a bunch of Shadow Toa running. Then he told us that he had been sent by the Great Beings to warn us about a group of evil beings called the Element Lords. He took the other Toa Mari, the Toa Haga, and the Toa Nuva into the desert to stop them. He took a bunch of Glatorian and the Ta-Koro Guard as well." Akamu was speechless. What could this mean? And what would happen when the Toa fought these Element Lords? Akamu's musings were interrupted by a crash, followed by a loud yell. The 4 of them turned, and watched as all the Matoran in the marketplace scattered. trying to flee from something nearby. A few moments after most of the Matoran had fled, the four Matoran were able to see what everyone was running from. A tall black and dark red Matoran stood on the other side of the street, standing over the dead body of a tall Matoran who wore a Kanohi cow. The murderer cackled and said, "That's 3 down and 2 to go." He turned around and spotted a Ga Matoran who had tripped and fallen in the stampede of fleeing Matoran. He raised his sword, preparing to kill another helpless citizen. In the split second as the blade came down, Kiwi grabbed a shield from a rack on another stall, and hurled it towards the murderer. The Ga Matoran let out a scream as the blade came down, but it struck the shield instead, and split the disc in 2, leaving the Matoran of water untouched. Damek rushed at the assassin, and struck him with his staff. The Ta Matoran rounded on him, and swung his blade, slicing the head off the staff, and almost slicing Damek's head off as well. The Yanu Matoran guardsman pulled out his newly purchased Darkstone, and held it up to the assassin's face, making him unable to see. The Ta Matoran cursed and said, "Using my own element against me?" He flailed his sword around, and he landed a blow on Damek's arm with the flat of his blade, causing the Darkstone to fall from Damek's hand and onto the ground. The Ta Matoran struck the stone with his blade, and it shattered into 100 pieces, temporarily shrouding the group in darkness. When all the Darkstone shards had fallen to the ground, the assassin was gone. Kiwi helped the Ga Matoran up, and she said, "Thank you for saving me." She let out a small giggle, and Kiwi replied, "Oh, no problem. The name's Kiwi, by the way." "Ameya," said the Ga Matoran. The conversation was interrupted by the salesman, a low Matoran, who picked up the 2 halves of the shield and moaned, "My business is ruined." Kiwi turned to him and said, "I'm sorry, I'll pay for it." The salesman shook his head and said, "No, look at my shop." He pointed across the street, and the 5 Matoran turned, expecting for it to be ruined, but it was, in fact, fine. Suddenly, Damek let out a laugh, and pointed to the sign that was hung above the stall, and the others began laughing as well. It read, "Best proto-steel weapons on the market, guaranteed to be unbreakable." The salesman sulkily walked over to his shop and tossed the 2 halves of the shield on the ground, and then began tearing down the sign. The group turned to see Vakama standing over the dead body of the Ta Matoran, and said, "Nuri, no. I thought keeping you here instead of letting you go with Matora would protect you, but instead it has killed you." Being the chronicler, Akamu had heard the stories of the old Metro Nui, and of the 6 Matoran who were thought to be the ones who would form the next Toa team, but instead, Vakama and the other 5 Turaga leaders had become the next team. Nuri had been one of those who was thought to be the next Toa of Fire. Suddenly, an idea hit Akamu. The assassin had said, 3 down and 2 to go. Could it mean that he was hunting down the 6? One of them had mysteriously betrayed the others, and disappeared recently, which would mean there were only 5. He quickly explained his theory to Vakama, and said, "He's probably heading for New Tessara to kill the last 2. We have to stop him." Vakama said, "Wait, chronicler, I agree, but you can't do it alone. I will call for Toa Krakua and Toa Thulo to go with you." Akamu's eyes narrowed. "By then it might already be too late. We have to go now." Before Vakama could stop him, Akamu had jumped up on Peachy's back and had charged off down the street. Damek jumped up on his own Usul Crab and swiftly followed the chronicler. Maidak jumped up on Puku's back and was about to ride off after the other 2 Anu Matoran, but Kiwi said, "I'm coming too." Ameya stepped forward and chipped in, "So am I." Maidak simply nodded, and the 2 of them hopped up on Puku's back, and then headed off after Akamu and Damek. To be continued.